This conference will now be recorded.
Hello and welcome to Coffee with the Commission with the Washington Medical Commission. Today we will be discussing key performance indicators of the Medical Commission. We will be focusing on the time frame from January through December of 2020. Joining us today we have Medical Commission Performance Manager, Sarah Chenford. Sarah is going to give an overview of the WMC metrics, and then we will use the rest of our time to answer your questions. This session is being recorded, so to keep background noise to a minimum, please use the chat function to ask questions during Sarah's initial presentation. And just so everyone understands, we cannot discuss specific licensing requirements, open cases, and ongoing investigations in this forum. So, with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Again, my name is Sarah Chembert, and I am the Performance Manager for the Washington Medical Commission. And we will be going over our 2020 Annual Performance Report. So in this presentation, I will be going over the performance measures that the Washington Medical Commission is statutorily required to report to the Secretary of Health. So a little bit of background. After a statute passed in 2008 that mandated the development of performance-based expectations that should focus on consistent, timely regulation of healthcare professionals, these particular performance measures were then developed and created in 2009 by the different licensing units within the Department of Health. There are different performance measures that apply to the various units within the WMC, and I will be reporting on those that apply to licensing, complaint intake, investigations, and legal. And in some sections, I will also be reporting on additional metrics that we have developed and track for our own performance records. So first up is the 2020 licensing performance. So performance measure 1.1 requires that at least 77% of applications submitted are processed within 14 days of receiving all of the required documentation. So looking at the chart, we can see that we stayed well above the 77%. On average, it was an annual average of 91% for 2020. And this is also an increase from 2019's annual average performance, which was at 86%. So we've improved this last year. Some additional licensing metrics. We track the number of applications processed. And so you can see on the chart, it's 2009 versus 2020 with the monthly breakdown, the gold being 2020. Licensing process, the most applications, 581 to be exact, in June of 2020, which was the most in the past 2 years in 1 month. And as the previous slide reflected, even with this high amount, 90% of those 581 applications were processed within 14 days in the month of June. We also track the renewals processed. So in 2020, the MD total, as you can see on the chart there in green, the total for 2020 was 14,732 renewals. For physician assistants, they are the blue bar. They had a total of 2,137 renewals. And the overall total was 16,869 renewals that were completed in 2020. And 61% of those were also completed via the online renewal process that we have set up. So 2020 complaint intake and assessment performance. So with this performance measure, we track the time it takes from the moment a complaint is received by the WMC to when it is presented to the case management team, or CMT as I'll call it throughout the next couple of slides. So performance measure 2.1 requires that 77% of cases will complete the intake and assessment steps in order to be presented to the CMT panel within 21 days. In 2009, there were 1,501 cases that completed the complaint intake and assessment step, and 24 of those were over the 21-day timeline, with a 98.4% rate for the year. But in 2020, there were 1,468 cases that completed the process, and only 5 were over the timeline. So that closed out 2020 at a rate of 99.6%, well over the 77% target. Some additional complaint intake metrics. This is a breakdown of both the complaint intake and assessment stages that make up performance measure 2.1. So with the data that we have, we are able to look at the complaint intake step and the assessment step individually. So on average in 2020, it took 3.4 days to enter a complaint into the database. And then after that, it moved into the assessment stage. And on average, it took about 16.9 days for the case to stay in assessment and then be presented at CMT. So a total of 20.3 days on average. And this is faster, nearly 34% faster than the previous year, in which it took an average of 25.6 days total on average. So additional complaint intake metrics, again, we also can look at the percent of cases authorized for investigation at CMT versus those that were closed. There was a 12.5% decrease in the number of complaints presented at CMT from 2019 to 2020. And in 2019, 36% of the 1,560 cases that were presented at CMT were authorized for investigation. In 2020, 26% of the 1,364 cases presented were authorized for investigation. 2020 investigations performance. So performance measure 2.2 reflects that we need to have at least 77% of investigations completed within 170 days. So looking at this chart, we don't want that green line to go below the red line, which is the target of 77%. So in June and July, you can see it dipped down below the 77% target. However, the annual average performance percentage was 82%. So that's above the 77% that is the target. And this is also a 22% increase from 2019's performance when they were at 68% for 2019. For performance measure 2.4, this one states that we do not want more than 23% of the investigations that are currently open to exceed 170 days in step. So these are the cases that are open currently. And this chart reflects a monthly breakdown of those cases that were open and the percentage of which were over timeline at the time. The cases that are open are in blue, and the number of those cases that were over 170 days are in orange in the bar. The green line reflects the percentage of the over timeline cases. So at no point in 2020 did the line ever go over the 23% cap. And the highest it was at was in May at 13.76%. The annual average for 2020 percentage of open cases that were over 170 days was about 7%. And this is down from 2019, when on average, it was about 12% of investigations were over 170 days every month. Excuse me. Performance measure 3.1 looks at the number of completed investigations per investigator. So there were 487 investigations closed in 2020. And over that year, we had an average of 9.6 investigators on staff. So that's 9 full-time and 1 part-time investigator. And they had an average of 50.7 cases closed per investigator over the year. And this breaks down to about 4.2 on average cases per month closed by each investigator. 2020 legal performance. For performance measure 2.5, we do not want more than 23% of our open cases to have exceeded 140 days in the step of case disposition. So looking at this chart, we want to be below the red line. In 2020, we had an average of about 40% of cases per month in the case dispo step that were over 140 days. So in 2020, workloads were strained due to COVID. We faced some logistical and technological challenges while adjusting to these new work norms. And it's important to note that once the case has entered the case disposition stage, it cannot move forward in the legal process or be closed until it has been presented to a panel of commissioners. And we typically, before COVID, we would present close to an average of 100 cases to the panels at each commission meeting. But however, due to the adjustments we had to make at the beginning of the pandemic, the WMC case presentations were capped at about 30 of the higher priority cases at the April, May, and July commission meetings. And we're still getting through some of the backlog from this time period. It's also important to note that COVID also affected the Attorney General's office workload and our expert witness availabilities. And these are external factors out of our control that, I mean, these are important external factors that are important to the case dispo step, but they're out of our control. And this has affected our case timelines and subsequently our performance numbers as well. Performance measure 2.8 is the percent of cases resolved within 360 days. So the target is we want at least 77% of cases to fall within one of the first two time frames. So looking at the chart, the green bar are the percent of cases that were closed from 0 to 180 days. The blue bar is 181 to 360 days. And then the orange is the percent of cases that were closed that were over 361 days or more. And we want at least 77% to be within the first two timeframes. And in 2020, 94.24% were closed within 360 days. So this is up from 91.18% that we had in 2019. And going into some of the discipline orders that we had in 2020, we had the majority were STIDs. We had 42 STIDs issued, 7 agreed orders, 1 stipulation to practice under conditions, 6 default waiver orders, and 4 final orders. So looking ahead at developing future performance measures. So the plan is I will be meeting with individual unit leadership quarterly along with Melanie and Jimmy. And so I'll be meeting with the management and licensing in legal and in investigations and complaint intake quarterly. And we're going to be discussing and developing unique and specialized performance measures that we can track internally that would help to increase productivity, and improve our customer service. So that's the plan going forward, along with reporting on the mandatory performance measures that we have in place right now. So I am ready now for any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. So this is the part of Coffee with Commission where we just kind of have an open dialogue. Any questions related to performance measures, please feel free to speak up. We don't have anything in the chat right now, but if anyone wants to have a conversation, please feel free to unmute yourself and join us.
And I'd also like to add that Mike Farrell has joined us, and he was part of the implementation and development of the performance measures. So if there's any questions regarding the history or the development, he's online too and has been gracious enough to join us to answer any questions.
Sarah, this is Charlie Brown. If I might ask, so people in general would ask me like, so how has the pandemic affected us, you know? And listening to what you say, it seems as though there was some effect here and there and so on. But what would you say then is the take-home message for like people who ask that question for 2020 on how we?
Well, I think as anyone would say, we had a lot to adapt to in a very short amount of time to adjust. I think we converted 90% of our internal staff to telecommuting. So it was just that adjustment period did affect, you could see from our performance measures adjusting. But I think now that we've kind of gotten into a groove and a rhythm and we've kind of adjusted quickly, that we're right back on track to performing and doing even better than we did before.
And I would also just add, we were mainly a paperless organization before COVID happened. And so we were actually in a pretty good position to make that transition into kind of remote work and doing things virtually. And so, like Sarah mentioned, those first couple commission meetings, the first couple months, there were a little bit of stumbling blocks. We were trying to get everyone adjusted. But overall, I think, everyone's done a really good job of adapting. Licensing is still pushing out credentials. Investigations and legal are still pushing out cases, and the commissioners are super responsive during their virtual business meetings. So, I think everyone's done really well given the circumstances. I don't think we saw more complaints this year. I don't know if there's just in terms of workload. I think that remained pretty consistent.
Thanks. Yeah, that was my next question. How the complaints went? But thank you.
We did have a handful. We didn't. So our internal complaint tracking system didn't have an allocation for COVID-related complaints in the beginning of the year, and so they kind of implemented that at the beginning of summer. And so we have a general idea of how many COVID-related complaints we had, but it's a little ambiguous just because of the timing. But we really just didn't have that many. There were a lot of just very similar standard of care issues, and we're able to handle those in the way we've always done it.
Will you be presenting that data at any time at all? I mean, I know that was another question I had. For example, I had one case that was COVID related. Could we somehow tease those numbers out and at some point in time hear what those complaints, kind of get a general sense of what the complaints were? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I know in the performance manager report for the fiscal year, that's on our website, I did have the numbers of the COVID cases, complaints that we had received listed in that report, but that was only for the fiscal year, so that cutoff was the end of June. So, but ongoing, we will be reporting on the COVID-related complaints, and I can say that I looked at the numbers in November, and I think there were probably about 40 complaints as of the end of November related to COVID.
And as Sarah mentioned, our meeting today is looking at 2020 annual, so January to December. But we actually operate on a fiscal year, which goes from July to June. And so during the fiscal report, we'll have a full year of data in terms of specific COVID-related complaints, and we'll just have more points that we can kind of tease out and see if there are any trends or kind of what those big issues related to COVID were. So I think we're all kind of looking forward. Well, I don't know if looking forward is the proper term, but once we have that year's worth of data, we'll be able to to kind of just make some better assumptions.
Great, thank you very much.
Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to take a moment and thank everyone for attending and participating, and thank Sarah for her excellent work. This recording and slide deck will be available on our website in the next few days, and we encourage you to share it with your circles and reach out if you have any questions. So on behalf of the WMC, thank you and take care.
Thank you.